Thank you very much. I want to thank you, Tadush, and Mark as well for your kind invitation. It is wonderful to see that there are lots of people in the audience. Unfortunately, I can't reach out to you and touch you. This is not exactly Buberian education, if you know what that means, a one-on-one kind of thing. But know that I am interested in each one of you, and I'm delighted and honored that you have tuned in to listen to me. Those of you that heard Professor Lasker last week know that he covered the medieval period. We will go back in time later on to cover the ancient period. My role is to speak about early modern and the place of Jewish-Christian relations in that particular epoch. What I want to do before I open up the screen and show you some text is to introduce to you what is the early modern period. I want to do that for about 5 minutes. As was mentioned, I wrote a whole book on the subject of trying to define early modernity. So if you're interested, you're going to have to learn more than my 5 minutes right now, but hopefully this will introduce you to then 3 case studies. Each one of them is taken from one of my books, and I don't claim that they are typical, but I think they are really interesting and really perhaps atypical, but nevertheless, they suggest the potential for Jewish-Christian interaction and connection in this very fascinating period in Jewish history and in general history as well. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to focus on 3 texts, 3 characters, and we're going to get into a serious discussion of each of them in the 45 minutes or so that I have allotted to me to speak. So first of all, the introduction, and then I will go on with the PowerPoint. I define the early modern period for Jews, for Jewish history, roughly from the end of the 15th century until the end of the 18th century. There have been those who would argue with me, and I'm happy to accept other schemes of dividing up this epoch. But and I have suggested a variety of characteristics why this period is unique and different from both the medieval period and the modern period. Let us just say, for those of you that have studied general history, things like the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, known as the Catholic Reform, the new discoveries of the world, the emergence of the Ottoman Empire, and so many other characteristics, economic changes, political changes, suggest indeed a period of change, of expansion of culture. I would focus on 2 factors among all others, though, as being critical both for Jews and non-Jews. One is the issue of mobility. People are on the move, and Jews especially are on the move. They're on the move because they are expelled. The most famous expulsion of this period is 1492, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. But also as they move eastward, later on in subsequent centuries, they are moving westward from east to west, so that we have very important turning points when Jews are moving as groups because they are forced to. But there are also many Jews who move for economic and social reasons as well. So that during this entire period, the itinerant Jew is very much a part of this cultural experience. That means the mixture of culture. Jews are interacting with Christians, but they're also reacting with other Jews. Those of you, for example, who have been to Venice know that there is a Sephardic synagogue, an Ashkenazic synagogue, an Italian synagogue, these small little communities within an urban landscape. In other words, they're all different kinds of Jews, but they are finally meeting each other, interacting with each other, particularly the Jews, for example, who are coming from Spain and Portugal to the Ottoman Empire. They, in fact, are learning new languages, preserving their own culture, but also evolving in a totally different cultural space. The other factor that is important is print. Print and the explosion of knowledge because of print is an enormous subject for historians of early modern Europe, and it has now been studied quite feverishly and in a fascinating way by Jewish historians as well. The impact of print, of course, is about the mobility of books, about the diffusion of knowledge, about printing presses created both by Jews and Christians, creating all kinds of Jewish books, the Talmud, Midrashim, biblical texts, biblical commentaries, a variety of contemporaneous books that spread from south to north, from east to west, from west to east, spreading knowledge and breaking down cultural barriers because of print. Print, of course, has much to do with codification. It has much to do with a book like the Shulchan Aruch, the great code of Jewish law, particularly with a commentary of written by Joseph Caro, but a commentary by the Ashkenazic Rabbi Moses Isserles, as if neighborhoods or particular regions are now merged because of print in under the umbrella of one book, one text that speaks to all Jews at once. Clearly, knowledge explosion, new centers, mixing Jews with Jews, mixing Jews between Jews and Christians and Jews and Muslims. New communities like Tzfat in Palestine, Krakow, Prague, Venice, Amsterdam, all created and becoming important in the early modern period. And finally, the issue of Jewish-Christian relations in this very, very short summary. It is extremely ambiguous and complicated to define Jewish-Christian relations. On the one hand, during this period of time, we see an Inquisition. We see the burning of the Talmud in the middle of the 16th century. We see censorship of Jewish books. We see the ghettoization of Jewish life in Italy. We see expulsions, as we've mentioned. But at the same time, the emergence of a diaspora filled with former Christians who become Jews, namely the Converso diaspora. And we see especially the emergence of a new field of study on an accelerated level, and that, of course, is Christian Hebraicism. The love of Hebrew books, the printing of Hebrew books is not simply something that Jews are partaking of, but is also something that involves and transforms the Christian world in the Renaissance, in the Reformation, and in the scholarly world of the 17th and 18th century. In other words, this growing appreciation of Judaism as a culture is countered by a growing persecution of Jews at the same time. And that contradiction is what makes this period so difficult to define and so complicated to understand in terms of the relationship between Jews and the surrounding culture. Now, what I want to do is move to a share, and hopefully I will do this. I'm still a novice at this, but I'm going to go to my share screen and give me a minute. And here it is. And then I press share. And I hope all of you will now see a green screen that says Jewish Christian Encounters in Early Modern Europe. And what I'm going to do is even make it bigger. If I can get under, how do I get rid of that black thing there so I can get under it? If I can't, let's see if I can do that. No, I can't. Let me just see if I can press this and do that. No, I wanted to make it larger, but it's not so terrible the way it is. So we'll just leave it. Hopefully you can see it. I don't know how to get rid of the black on top, and I don't want to fool with that or I'll mess. My black thing is on top. All right, let's just leave it the way it is. So here I would introduce three characters, and I'm going to take a look at my time because I want to allot each more or less the same time. Over 10 years in the 1980s, I spent working on two books on a character named Abraham Yagel. Yagel was a Renaissance doctor. He was also a Kabbalist, a student of Jewish mysticism. And he was also interested in magic. These three aspects of his career fascinated me, and I called a book I wrote, Kabbalah, Magic, and Science, about Yagel's biography. I also spent another 5 years editing a text, a autobiography, and a story using Italian novella, or stories from the period of time, to create a journey of Yagel and his father to discovering the heavens, a heavenly journey. A fascinating character. But what I want to focus on now is a work which you would not expect to find among a nice Jewish man named Avram Yagel. He lived at the end of the 16th and early 17th century, a Jewish Catechism. And here is a version of it. There are 40 editions of this text, and I don't have the first one. Actually, this is too small for you to see, but I actually, when Mark and I were at Yale, there was a student who, right before his orals, gave me a present. I don't know if he was trying to bribe me or not, before his oral exams, but the book that he gave me was Sefer Lekach Tov, a good instruction, which is the Catechism. This is the second edition from Amsterdam. The first edition was 1795, Venice. Why would a nice Jewish boy write a catechism based on Peter Canisius's Catholic catechism? Canisius, in the middle of the 16th century, published for the Catholic world 3 catechisms, a large one, a medium-sized one, and a very small one for little kids. Basically a statement of faith, a statement of the principles of faith. Ikarei ha'emunah, to translate it into Hebrew. Why would a Jew copy that for Jews? That's the most unbelievable thing. Well, one answer you can find, so here you're looking at, by the way, before I turn this page, you're looking at a version that was published in London in 1679 in Latin, Hebrew on one side. I only have the first page. It says Abraham Yagel from Montelici, which is near Mantua. And there you will see, and this guy was a convert himself. Here is a reason why he may have published the work. According to a very famous Jewish, a Christian, a bibliographer of Hebrew works, in his Bibliotheca Magna Rabbinica, here is an entrance on Avram Yagel, and you can see it in Hebrew and Latin. If you don't read either language, don't worry. There's nothing there to read except the one line about he is to be identified with a man named Camillus Yagel. You see that way down in the Latin, and it's there somewhere in the Hebrew too. Camillus Yagel, of course, was a convert. So the reason he wrote a catechism was because he became a Christian. Well, that story now is not precise, is not correct. Abraham Yagel was the brother of Camilo Yagel. I did not know this when I wrote my 2 books on him, but now a young scholar named Federica Francesconi has published from the archives the fact that Camilo Yagel and his son converted to Christianity. And he became one of the chief censors of the Catholic Church. I've seen many works in Hebrew signed by Camilo Yagel as the censor who went through the text to make sure it did not offend Christianity. Avram Yagel remained a Jew his entire life. But clearly, the experience, perhaps the traumatic experience of having a brother convert to Christianity, might have had an impact upon him. In any case, he translates, and he does so as a Jew, and it is accepted by Jews. Let me just show you this very, very quickly, going down my list here. So here, for example, I don't have the English version, but these are the 7 deadly sins. There are 7 virtues and 7 sins in the Catholic Catechism. And here it is in Hebrew. And if you can't read the Hebrew, maybe you can read the Yiddish version. There's a Yiddish version. Hold on. Yeah, there it is. That's the Yiddish version of the same text. While I don't have the right page, I want to show you that this was translated into English as well. It's called the Jews Catechism, which was lately translated out of Hebrew and Latin by the same convert that we saw before in the 1679 edition in London. This was also came out a year later, so we see all the versions of it. The question is, what is a Jew doing translating a catechism? And the answer is, it was an innocent effort not to present Christianity, but to create a Jewish text that was in line with Christian thinking. In other words, for example, faith, hope, and charity, of course, is very much a part of the way this Jesuit text is characterized, written by Canisius. So here we have in the Hebrew version, bitachon, emunah, bitachon, ve'ahava. And he develops all three, and he actually takes out pages from the Canisius text. But what is he doing? When he gets to the Decalogue, he removes that because there's a line in the Talmud about if you publish the Decalogue separately, the Ten Commandments, that is, this could lead to heresy because there are more mitzvot than simply the Decalogue. So the Decalogue is not there, but what is there is the 13 principles of faith of Rambam, of Maimonides. So in other words, where he gets to a very Christian part, he puts in the Jewish version. So the whole thing comes out in such a way that it looks Jewish. What is going on here, therefore, is an extremely interesting thing, trying to place Judaism within a universal context. There is a religious message that all people have, not just Jews and not just Christians. And Jews are capable of expressing their own identity within a universal context. Now, were Jews offended by this? Well, I just want to give you another example, a very, very Jewish text, a very mystical text coming out of Eastern Europe called the Shnei Luchot HaBrit of Isaiah Horowitz. Quotes the whole section on Ahava, on charity, in his own text. He's not aware that this is a catechism. He thinks it's a Musar work. It's a work of Jewish morality and ethics. And therefore, he sees it perfectly listed. So this book is published in Hebrew in many editions. It is translated into Yiddish. It is translated into Latin. It is translated into German. It is translated into English and French. And it has a long history that goes right up until the 19th century. When, in fact, in the 19th century, Jews are publishing lots of catechisms, particularly emerging out of Reform Judaism in the 19th century, who are trying to define Judaism for themselves. Now, what is a catechism? On the one hand, it demarcates what is Jewish faith. Here are the principles of Jewish faith, 1, 2, 3, 4. At the same time, as we've said, it creates a language which is common to all human beings. It places Judaism within the context of a much broader universal message. Now, let me show you something else, which I am kind of embarrassed to show you. I don't know how many of you could even read this, but this is a written text, right? It is my handwriting. It's not an ancient text. It is ancient already. I copied it, I think, 30 or 40 years ago. But it is from a longer text called the Beit Yar HaLevanon. It's a book about Encyclopedia of Jewish Learning that Avram Yagel wrote. And in this excerpt, and I'm not going to try to read very much of it, it describes, if we look at the nations of the world and on those nations that did not see the lights of the Torah and of worship and of prophecy and of miracles, you will hear about their notion of God. And here is a group of pagan philosophers who wrote about the one God, who Yagel is translating actually from a very well-known source, Agrippa, into Hebrew, and arguing that if you look at this very carefully, you will see that all of these people have the same notion of one God. Now, this is unbelievable for a Jew to argue that Judaism and its belief in one God is not totally unique. I'm not going to translate the whole thing, but there is Orpheus going down. Here is Zoroaster. These are all pagan philosophers. Let me go down one more. Here is a poem by the great Hermes Agadol, Tefilato Elohim, and his prayer to God. Here I give you the Latin of Ficino right below, which he took this from. And what it says here is that if you look carefully and you don't be too picayune about what you're reading, you will hear the same tone, the same idea, the same notion of a one God, even among the pagan philosophers. And notice the last philosopher on the line, philosophe Platon, Plato. So this is what is called in the Renaissance ancient theology, the idea of a universal core of truth for all peoples. And perhaps the way to understand the Catechism is to link it with this text as well, also written by Yagel, and also his book of novella, which are taken from Catholic teaching and transformed into Hebrew in a Hebrew way. What this Jew is doing, therefore, is engaging with the non-Jewish world, not by closing it off, not by arguing it as heresy, but trying to find a common language, a common way of understanding Judaism within the context of Christianity and the non-Jewish world, and arguing that on some level Jews can be Jews, perhaps an answer to his brother Camilo, who gave up on Judaism entirely. One can still be a Jew and still espouse a kind of universal faith. All right, so that is my first example, and I'm sure there might be some questions about that later on, but let's move on to the second in the meantime. So now we are going to the early part of the 18th century and the end of the 17th century. This comes from another book of mine called Connecting the Covenants, and it is a work which starts with this work. It is about the rediscovery of the Mishnah, that code of Jewish law that was edited around 200 CE by Yehuda HaNasi, by Judah the Prince. In the early modern period, the Mishnah sees an enormous interest among Jews and among Christians. And therefore, we can argue that this is the Mishnah century. In about 3 or 4 months, my colleagues at Oxford, Joanna Weinberg and Pete von Buxel, will publish an enormous book on the Christian Mishnah in the early modern period, and it is filled with remarkable essays about the history of this fascination. But let's just speak for a second about the Jewish involvement with the Mishnah in the early modern period. And I'm going to go through this really quickly. I don't have really time to explain it in great detail. The Maharal of Prague in the 16th century was particularly interested in Mishnah study rather than Talmudic pilpul and in Talmudic involved criticism, but returning basically to the direct study of the Mishnah and its sources. Commentaries became popular in this period and were published, of course, by Jewish printing presses. Maimonides, Bertinora, Tosafot Yom Tov Lippmann Heller. All of these commentaries became standard text. Even in this text, which I'll point out to you in a second, Maimonides and Bertinora are integrated into this Latin text. The Mishnah in the circle of the Kabbalists and Safed. I just read a remarkable text by Amnon Raz Krakotskin of Ben Gurion University on the Mishnah in Safed and its place within the culture of the Kabbalists of Safed in the 16th century. On the Christian side, Christians are moving to study the Mishnah as well. And one might call this period, which emerges especially in the 17th and the 18th century, the era of not only Christian Hebraicism, an interest on the part of Christians in Hebrew texts, but an interest in rabbinic texts, and particularly the Mishnah. The Mishnah as a means of unraveling the world of Jesus Christ. The most important, this begins with a whole series of works on the Mishnah, which I'm not going to mention lots of names here, but the culmination of this was written by a man named Gulielmus Suranusius, as you see on the screen before us. This is a 6-volume folio edition of the Mishnah, in which he puts in Maimonides and Bartanura, translated all into Latin, with illustrations, and with Suranusius' own commentary and his own introductions. It is a work of enormous erudition, of having mastered. We have the library of Suranusius, at least the listing that was in his library. He was a professor at the University of Amsterdam, and he became one of the great Christian Hebraists of his period. This work is an extremely interesting work, and what follows after it is another work by Suranusius called Sefer HaMashveh. Suranusius decided that there was something wrong with the way the Old Testament had transmitted its teaching into the New Testament. That when you look at the New Testament, the passages from the Old Testament are misquoted or mishandled. You have either two options. Either the original Hebrew text is wrong, and therefore, for some Christians, we have to create a new text that is not based upon the Masoretic text of the Jews, or perhaps there's something wrong in the way the Christians conveyed it in the first place, or perhaps they misunderstood their own New Testament. What he argues in Sefer HaMashveh is that what we need to do is to go back to the midot of the rabbis, to the hermeneutical principles. We have to learn how to read essentially the hermeneutics of the rabbis, how the rabbis understood their own texts. And when we do that and we apply them to the New Testament, we will come up with a new meaning of our own text. And therefore, he publishes a work in which he explains how New Testament passages can be understood by reading how the rabbis understand a text, how they interpret their own texts. Clearly, for Suranusius, the Mishnah is therefore not only an aid to Christian understanding, it is, in fact, a Christian text or teaches a Christian truth. The Mishnah comes from the same period of Jesus and the disciples, and therefore the Mishnah is a Christian text as well as a Jewish text. And therefore we Jews and we Christians share something together. He tells the story of he figured this out. One day he was walking in Amsterdam and he met a rabbi, unidentified. And he tells the rabbi, I can't figure this out. The New Testament doesn't fit the Old. The New Testament doesn't quote Old Testament passages properly. And the rabbi told him, go learn Mishnah and you will understand the New Testament better. Now, forget about the chronology here and the difficulty in whether this works or not. I'm not suggesting you should all go out and study Mishnah to understand the New Testament. Maybe you should. But in any case, this was Suranusius' understanding. And from this, a whole group of exegetes, Christian exegetes, at the end of this, adopted the method of Suranusius. And here I go on very quickly. So here's the next step. A William Wooten in London takes the text, several masechtot, several sections of the Mishnah, and he translates them into English. So now we are not speaking only about an academic exercise. We're speaking about now putting it in the vernacular. And Wooten also publishes a text for seminarians, which explains how to teach the Mishnah in a Christian seminary. So what we have going on here is an extraordinary move on the part of a group of Christian scholars to study rabbinic materials. Not so much the Talmud itself, but the Mishnah, because it is more or less coterminous with Jesus and the disciples. And here I take you to now the text that I want to look at a little bit more carefully. This appears in the beginning of the text, and I'm going to have trouble reading it because it's blocked on my side unless I get rid of the pictures. But I guess I could do that by doing view. But nevertheless, look at this. This is by Simon Oakley. Simon Oakley was one of the great figures in the history of Islam. He studied Islam and he also studied Semitic languages. and he was at Cambridge. And he was asked to write essentially a testimony, a positive letter, supporting Wotton's translation of the Mishnah. And here is the letter that appears at the beginning of, it says postscript here, but it was published within the text of Wotton. And just take a look at a few of the lines. We are obliged to you, writing to Wotton now, for having evinced beyond all contradictions that Hebrew learning is necessary for us Christians. If I had ever had an opportunity, I would most certainly have gone through the New Testament under a Jew. Whatever some of our gentlemen may think, this I am well assured of, that they understand it infinitely better than we do. They are thoroughly acquainted with the forms of speech and with all the allusions, which, because they occur but rarely, are obscure to us, though in common use and very familiar among them, as has been admirably demonstrated by the learned Cyrenusius in his Reconciliator, which is Sefer HaMashbeh, that text which shows how to use rabbinic interpretation to read the New Testament. I remember I have read Father Simon, that is Richard Simon, the great Hebraist in France. I believe it is an appendix to his Leon Modena. Leon, he translated the Venetian Jew Leon Modena's Riti, a work on Jewish ritual, into French. And it just so happened that Simon Oakley translated it into English. So both of them knew Leon Modena very well. That he once offered in the epistles to the Hebrews in Hebrew to a learned rabbi in Paris, who, after he had perused it without taking any manner of notice of the difference in religion, said that whoever was the author of that book, he was a great mikubal, that is, a Kabbalist, and thoroughly versed in all the traditions of the Jewish nation. So that now the Epistle of the Hebrews now becomes a work of Kabbalah, a work of Jewish mysticism. All right, I'll leave the rest of you to read on your own, but you can see here essentially an extraordinary recognition on the part of a Christian scholar in the value of rabbinic writing and the need to understand, and there's certain irony here, I mean, given the history of Jewish-Christian interaction, of a Christian saying, if you want to understand the New Testament, you need a Jew to lead you through it. You can't do it on your own. Does not suggest, indeed, the complexity of Jewish-Christian relations over time more than any other example I can give you. But I have one more example, and I'm going to run out of time, so I want to move to it. So now I come to my third case study. And forgive me for rushing through this. I hope I didn't lose your attention or your understanding in this process. This is a favorite text of mine, and I spent a number of years working on this text as well. Sefer HaBrit, or the Book of Covenant, was written first in 1797. I argue, and I think correctly, that it is one of the most popular Hebrew works written in the modern era. This takes us to the end of the 18th century, but there are 40 editions of this work. It was published in Yiddish. It was published in Ladino. There is no English translation of the work. Pinchas Horowitz was an Eastern European Jew who was fascinated with Kabbalah, and he decided to write a commentary on one of the great Kabbalists of the 16th century. So this places us now an 18th century Jew writing a commentary on Chaim Vital's Ruach HaKodesh. Chaim Vital was the great disciple of Isaac Luria and one of the luminaries of the Kabbalistic revival, the mystical revival of Jewish life in Safed in the 16th century. Ruach HaKodesh is interested in trying to define the notion of prophecy and to argue that any Jew can become a prophet. So the premise of this work is an interest in prophecy, or in creating prophecy, even though the prophets have long died and have gone from the scene of our world. Jews today can still become prophets. That's basically the argument. But Pinchas Horowitz does it in a very strange way. He needs to sort of fill in the blanks. There's something missing in Vital's treatise. What is missing is science. what we need to know is the sciences of the world. And therefore, what Pinchas Horowitz Sefer Habrit does in the first part of the book, about 250 pages, here I showed you, here are two new, these are the latest two editions. I know you can't see very much here. This is the book that I marked up every damn page because I read it very carefully. It's about 400 or 500 pages. And here's a new edition that came out since I wrote my book. This is really nice. It's menukad, and it's not menukad, but it's very beautiful with all kinds of. This came out also from an Orthodox Jew. There are Haredi Jews that read this book as their textbook on science even today, even though it was written in the 18th century. In any case, the book is about science. It is about Kabbalah. It is about arriving at the last chapter. You enter a room, you cleanse yourself, and you prepare to receive the Ruach HaKodesh, the Spirit of God, so that you can become a prophet. But what does it have to do with Jewish-Christian relations? Well, here's the text. The text, the penultimate text of this book is called Ahavat Re'im. It is taken from Leviticus. The famous text, of course, V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And here is Pinchas Horowitz writing on this text. Now, I should tell you all along, if you look through most of the commentaries on this text within the Jewish tradition, right up until the 18th century, most of them the word re'acha is the difficult word here. What does a re'ah mean? Does it mean a Jew or a Christian? And most exegetes will say it refers to a Jew. Here is what Pinchas Horowitz says. The essence of the love of neighbors is to love the entire human race, regardless of which nation or language one belongs to, since every human being is made in the divine likeness and image and occupies himself with the betterment of the world by building, plowing, planting, trading, etc., or a craft. He generates his thinking so as not to neglect the needs of other creatures, and he prepares the world in his wisdom, envisioning and investigating and replicating wonderful instruments and creations through his own ingenuity, by which he labors. For through these things, the world stands properly and exists in perfection, while all these things exist before God created and made them. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole text. The chapter is 70 pages. And it is quite a discussion of the notion of loving the other. What is interesting here is that it is not simply a philosophical treatise. It is basically a text which argues that before you can receive the Ruach HaKodesh, before you can become a prophet, you have to love all human beings. In other words, it is the primary prerequisite before becoming a prophet. Now, this guy is not a Reformed Jew. He's not teaching Tikkun Olam here. He's not a liberal person from the West. He's an Eastern European Jew who is an Orthodox. His text was originally written in Yiddish and then translated into Hebrew. And here, let me show you a little bit more of it, but these are translations that I made, of course. At the end of the text, there is a whole discussion of the two angels, the cherubim, the kruvim. And there we get the notion again that two babies, when they looked at each other for the first time, when they play with each other, they immediately love each other because love is a human emotion that is embedded in the heart of all human beings and begins at birth. Now, where does all of this come from? Well, here I don't have the time to develop it, but I want to just show you. Here is the one reference that gives me an idea where he got this. He describes a prince who, during a flood of the River Oder in Germany, in Frankfurt on the Oder in 1785, went out to save people's lives because the flood was overtaking their homes, and he ultimately lost his life. His name was Leopold of Braunschweig. This became a cause célèbre on the part of Christians at the end of the 18th century. And here we have a visual evidence of this. Here are three pictures by three very famous painters of this prince going out and ultimately dying, but trying to save his his citizens from losing their life. And this becomes the example of a person who has generosity and cares about other human beings, and therefore becomes the exemplary human being. Horowitz not only copies the entire story, but suggests that indeed this is the example he wants to offer for a person who loves other human beings. Now, and here, let me just show you finally what the text looks like itself. This is the first page of the text. These are two editions of Sefer HaBrit. The first one is from Brun in 1797. The second one is the larger edition in Vilna in 1817. But there, as I said, there are 40 editions of this text. And you see, that's a long title page. But in that title page, it's a kind of table of contents. He describes all the things that he's going to do in this book. The first half, again, is about science. The second half is about spiritual things and ultimately arriving at the level of prophecy. I don't know what you make of this text, and what is so interesting is that I spent a lot of time in my book describing how this was read by so many different readers right up to the 21st century, and is still read today. Do rabbis actually read this and say, yes, you have to love all human beings? I mean, does chauvinism and parochialism all go away when you read this text? I don't know. Maybe they ignore it. There was so much in this book that you could choose and pick whatever you want to read. The book is about prophecy. Rabbis did not excise this chapter from the book. In fact, it was once published separately in a Ladino version, just this one chapter in the Ottoman Empire. But what is interesting here is that here is a Jew coming from Eastern Europe, not under the influence of anyone else, who decides on his own that the notion of loving other human beings is critical in terms of one's Jewish identity. So what I'm giving you, and I think it's almost time, and I'm really good at this, but let me sort of bring this together. I'm not good at doing this. I'm good at finishing on time. But I want to look back at the three examples I've given you. I know there are weird examples. They are exceptional examples, but that's the nature of the history that I like to do. I like to find weird things that are not so obvious. Atypical, perhaps, is a better word. And suggest the potentiality of what can one find when one looks into the corners of the past and tries to find the voices of people expressing themselves in relationship to the other. And the early modern period, as I said, there are ups and downs. There is persecution. There are expulsions. There are inquisitions. There are burnings of the Talmud. At the same time, there is a new interest on the part of Christians, as we saw in the case of the Mishnah, in the study of rabbinic texts. Does the study of Jewish books mean a greater interest in Jews themselves? That is a tricky question and can't be answered fully in the positive, but at least it offers the potential or the possibilities of new human encounter. It is a very interesting period in that people are publishing together, are reading the same books, are expressing themselves, are learning about each other. And here I refer, as I said, both Jews to Jews as well as Jews to Christians. The case of the Jewish Catechism in the 16th century, or the case of the Sefer HaBrit and its love of all human beings, are also interesting expressions of the past. We don't have to wait till the 21st century to talk about universal love, or to talk about the notion that that we Jews or we Christians need to find some kind of common basis for talking with each other, finding a vocabulary, a language. In any case, these are available, and I guess the last thing that these examples say is that, and I'll be the first to admit it, all history is autobiography. My looking for these particular texts says something about me and my interest in the past, or recovering the past. My Techiyat HaMetim, my recovery of the dead, is looking for voices that perhaps resonate with my own background and experience and interest in the present. So with that, I will close, and hopefully you have got something out of these texts I presented to you. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Professor Ruderman. wonderful job of Tzchiyat HaMetim and bringing those three different examples and synthesizing them in such a wonderful way. I'm going to begin with some general questions from the audience. So I know you've written about this, but not everyone has read your work. There was some curiosity about the extent to which Jews were able to study at universities, which at this point really were Christian universities at that point, and how much knowledge, the extent to which they were accepted, what they were studying, and how much knowledge they were able to learn that they then brought back to the Jewish community from those universities.
You sure you didn't plant that question? That's too easy. Okay, yes. Professor Bretler is right in that I have written exactly on this topic. The first major university to accept Jews in the early modern period was in Padua, and it's medical school, the same medical school that Galileo, of course, was a student. And of course, where can Jews study within a medieval or an early modern university? They can't study in law school because that is, of course, Christian law, and they can't study theology, so they go to medical school. Jews were doctors for a long time before the early modern period, but clearly in this period of time, the medical schools begin to open their doors to Jews, and Jews flock to them. Over the course of the next century or two, several hundred Jews graduated from Padua, and then from Bologna, and then from Amsterdam, and from other universities in the north, and throughout all of Italy. What we have are a network of Jewish physicians who emerge out of these universities and then travel all over the Jewish diaspora. Even in Eastern Europe, we have many Jewish doctors that make their way to Prague, and from Prague to Krakow, to Lublin, to other places where they get jobs as physicians. The physician, for me, is a kind of intermediary between Jewish and Christian culture. It is true that the physician, of course, is studying medicine primarily. The physician also needs to pass Latin exams to get into the university. The physician needs to study Latin text. The physician becomes aware of the humanitas, of the humanities in general, and therefore becomes an enlightened individual. Some would even argue that some of the early physicians in the 18th century were involved in the early Haskalah, or in the Haskalah itself. In other words, there was a direct connection between the study of medicine and larger Enlightenment culture, and Jews, and clearly the university was a vehicle together with print. They go together, and I just left out the university because of time, but clearly the university is also part of the story of this knowledge explosion. Doctors are intermediaries, not only between Jews and Christians, they're between upper and lower class. In other words, they take care of everybody. And therefore, there's something going on with this community of physicians, which is really quite fascinating. Physicians correspond with Christian physicians, and therefore you have this ongoing dialogue that seems to be going on from the 16th century on, and becomes quite important by the 18th century. But notice again, this begins in the early modern period, not only in the modern period as well.
David, you might want to stop sharing your screen.
Okay. I was just holding it up to see if anyone wanted to refer to anything there, but I should take it off. I will.
I think so.
Okay.
Yes. So another question is actually a follow-up to what you just said. To what extent do you see the period you're talking about is similar to what's often called the Golden Age of Spain, and to the extent that in both we're talking about a certain type of Jewish openness to other genres and to other religions, and to the extent that there is some similarity, could you talk about that a little more broadly, please?
Sure. Well, yes, of course there's a similarity. I like to make the comparison, especially between the Jews of Italy during the Renaissance and post-Renaissance and the Baroque period, particularly in the area of poetry, where poetry has a kind of revival in Italy, which reminds us of a poetry, drama, belles lettres. All of these things had emerged earlier in Italy. In Spain, of course, when we speak about the Golden Age of Spain, we're speaking about Jews living within a Muslim culture. Even though the Reconquista begins already in the 11th century and the Christians are coming down and starting to take over the whole area, essentially the early period of Hebrew poetry and Hebrew belles lettres was, of course, in an Islamic world. What is interesting here is that this is a Christian world, and therefore this brings new strains, and that's why more ambiguities I spoke about. In other words, it is burning of the Talmud and also loving the Talmud at the same time on the part of Christians, or the Christians are involved in the printing of all kinds of Jewish books, etc., while at the same time they are banishing Jews or ghettoizing Jews or doing all kinds of things. And of course, early modern Europe, while I like to paint it as a kind of a consciousness of an entire community, there are very important differences. The largest part of the Jewish community in early modern Europe are in Poland and the Ottoman Empire. And there, of course, their contact with the outside world is not as profound. There is a kind of acculturation to Polish culture or to Ottoman culture, but it is a very different kind of interaction than what was going on in Italy or in Amsterdam. So there are variations, and as I guess you felt by the question that was asked, my interest has been for a long time Italy, later on England, the Western European experience, where there are more intense personal encounters between Jews and Christians. But through books and through these doctors that I mentioned, it is never closed off. So again, there are parallels, but clearly we would have to explore what was the essence of the Jewish-Muslim connection versus the Jewish-Christian connection. And there would be some interesting parallels, but also important differences. But you are right in arguing that in every period, Jews draw from the outside world to redefine and rethink and reshape their own cultural identity.
Thank you. So some specific questions about each of the three figures. About Avraham Yagel and his catechisms. You were suggesting that they were for internal consumption for Jews. At least two people have wondered whether this was any attempt at proselytizing Christians by offering Jewish views in a type of form that Christians were used to.
Yeah, I would be suspicious also by asking the same question. He's very careful. If you go through the whole book, which I can't do obviously now, you'll see that he's very careful to remove any association with Christianity. When you read the book over, you would not think it's a Christian book. You would just think it's a Musar book. It's a book about ethics and morality and defining Jewish principles. But of course, the very notion of presenting the principles of Judaism in a kind of catechismic form is very Christian. In other words, if the content is not Christian, the form is Christian for sure. And of course, the concepts, when they are neutral, like hope and charity, etc., they come from a Christian source, whether you know it or not. I suggest in the case of Avraham Yagel that perhaps he's trying to find a solution to the dilemma he has over his brother. He doesn't convert. He's on the precipice of converting. I mean, he buys the idea that all other knowledge is equal and we can get to God in many ways. I mean, in that sense, he's way over the top in terms of his openness to other cultures. But nevertheless, he does not convert. So, is he a missionary? I mean, apparently not. But I don't have the answer. I don't have a dialogue that he has between him and his brother. But perhaps he's arguing that Judaism is elastic enough, is open enough to allow for this perspective without having to give up on one's Jewishness. On the other hand, the later editions of the work were done by converts, and they were used by converts. So you're absolutely right in pointing out that this text could be used by missionaries later on. In other words, Christians could use it. Recent converts to Christianity could use it. It had many purposes, and the editors who kept publishing this over and over again had all of their own particular reasons. So that the history of this text simply did not address one issue. It addressed many audiences and many issues simultaneously, which makes it such a fascinating text. But your question still remains. I mean, I can't get into Yagel's mind any more than I was able to do, and I still don't have the answer fully.
So if one of the earlier questions compared your era to the golden age of Spain, another question related to your middle figure asked about the Mishnah. And I don't know if the entire audience knows, but in the last few decades in Jewish studies, there's been a real resurgence of interest in the Mishnah again. And in several months, a work called the Oxford Annotated Mishnah is going to come out, which is a good New English translation of the Mishnah with a short commentary. I mean, what do you think the period that you're talking about and our own period have in common, which might explain this renewed interest in the Mishnah in so recently?
Yeah, no, I'm aware of that, and you know, when I was working on London on this project many years ago, and then I participated in this Oxford seminar in which this book is coming out. They're called the Christian Mishnah in the early modern period. I was well aware of that. I think it has to do again with that very complicated love-hate relationship between Jews and Christians. Christians are exploring their own identity through Judaism. They did it already with the Tanakh, but they felt the need to do it now in terms of rabbinic texts that were written around the same period as the foundation of Christianity, and finding all kinds of parallels. It sort of reminds me, remember when we were at Yale together many years ago. It's like I'm speaking to you, although the questioner is someone else, I assume. But the whole debate, Wayne Meeks, whether we should study Christianity primarily through a Greek prism, or we need to study Christianity through Judaism. And Jewish students need to study Christianity, and Christian students need to study Rabbinic Judaism. And at that time, I was very proud of Yale, and that it had really committed itself to engaging in this cross-cultural fertilization between the two worlds. I think that need, in other words, what I'm describing is the genesis of what I think is going on now today. I honestly believe that Christians can find in these texts some kind of interesting notion of themselves. I suggest that someone translate the introduction of Cyrenius to his Mishnah, and you wouldn't believe the way he expresses his love for Judaism and his feeling that the way Jews express themselves in the Mishnah is indeed a Christian way. Very hard. I mean, of course, this is also part of something called Jews for Jesus. And in my most recent book on missionaries, I actually explore a missionary from the 19th century who I argue has a kind of Jewish soul, if that's possible. Maybe I'm looking too hard to find it, but nevertheless, again, showing how these categories are overlapping and these identities overlapping. That is really the fascination with the study of Jewish-Christian relations in this period and other periods as well, of how no matter how they try to separate themselves or denigrate the other, they still need each other, and they're still coming together in all kinds of interesting ways. I assume at some point with this new book on Cyrenius and the material that is out in English, that this will become extremely interesting to contemporary folks as well.
A question about your third figure, about Pinchas Horowitz and Sefer HaBrit. There was some surprise by a number of people on the extent to which he deviates from Maimonides' perspectives on prophecy. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, you mean the notion that because he argues that you have to love Christians first. Yeah, Maimonides said you have to tolerate Muslims. He was living in a Muslim world, but he didn't. He said not Christians. Yeah, he does deviate from Maimonides, even though he cites Maimonides throughout Sefer HaBrit in a positive way. But I'm kind of used to that already. I mean, first of all, Maimonides has a long history of being quoted and misquoted and used for one's own personal ideological persuasion. That we can describe also in terms of recent political discourse in Israel, but I won't get into that question. But clearly, you were right. This is an extent. I didn't quote. There was a paragraph on the second page that I didn't quote, where he says, "I want to tell you about the sources of where I got this from." I really couldn't find anything, so I created this for myself, and from the one line in Leviticus, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," which I understood to be all human beings. I shall love thy neighbor as thyself. And so he admits that this is his innovation. Now, I must argue that there is already, by the 18th century, a number of thinkers who have moved to argue that Christianity is not paganism and that Christianity is a higher level of spirituality, and that we should respect and be cognizant of Christian monotheism. But I could not find anyone that argued that you need to love a Christian in the way that he describes, nor argue that this is a prerequisite to becoming a Jewish prophet. So in this sense, this is a unique expression. But again, I asked the question, how did this book become so popular? It's not always, this chapter is not always quoted, but it remains there. It was read. Did it have any influence? What did rabbis think of it? And what does it have to do with Jewish prophecy? I don't have an answer to that question, but I stare in amazement to see how he developed this chapter and how important this notion was to his own way of thinking.
I'm going to ask one last question, which will be an opportunity, I hope, to bring some of this together. So some adjectives you used about these figures: weird, unique, exceptional, and atypical. But you have at least three of them that you talked about. So maybe a few parts to this question. How atypical was this really, especially given the number of editions that these books went through, which means that there were readers, people were buying them. So this could not have been totally exceptional. Now, I don't know how as a historian you measure how exceptional something is, but I'd be curious to hear about that from you as an exception, excuse me, and to the extent that you're engaged in Chiyat HaMetim, bringing these ideas back to life. So clearly you think that these texts from several centuries ago have real potential for contemporary Jewish-Christian relations. So if you could talk about that a little bit as well, please.
Very good questions, whoever asked them. Yeah, weird and exceptional. Maybe I was sort of kind of apologizing to myself for presenting them to you as, if I were to teach this whole period, obviously I would talk about the ups and downs, and not every figure is, it takes these lines of thought. But you're absolutely right in pointing out that at least in the case of Yagel and in the case of Pinchas Horowitz, they were well read. They were well read by different communities of Jews. In the last chapter of my book on Sefer HaBrit, it is amazing. I start with the Orthodox Jewish community, with poskim, Hasidim, mitnagdim. Then I go into Yiddish writers, and then I go into American writers, and I go into secular Israeli writers, and all of them are no Sefer HaBrit from their childhood. It was on sort of on the Orthodox Jewish shelf, a kind of book which introduced us to the world and was also spiritual at the same time. That's the other thing about my doctors and about science in this period. Science is still somehow emerges within a spiritual matrix. These doctors were still very much part of the Jewish community. We have Jewish doctors receiving Nobel Prizes today, but they're not necessarily all involved in the Jewish community. In this period of time that I'm describing, medicine came out of a deep sense of Jewish identity, but let's leave that question aside. So On the other hand, Cyrenius was considered to be a weirdo among certain Christians in his time. And not all Christians accepted the notion by any means that one should study the Mishnah. In other words, this was a particular school of thought. So perhaps on the Christian part, I could say that this was exceptional and unique, but nevertheless, it had wide ramifications. And if one begins to study Cyrenius and his impact, it is not so small as one would think initially. But nevertheless, there was clear opposition. I would assume also that for some Jews, the notion of a catechism was still unfamiliar ground and was something that later on was associated with liberal Jews who were creating catechisms in German and English in the 19th century. Although they weren't based on Yagel, Yagel was the first, but nevertheless, they created their own. So anyway, on the first question, unusual, but nevertheless a part of that culture, and I'd like you sort of pushing back and telling me that perhaps they are a part. Again, I would argue in the case of Sefer HaBrit, how many people really read this chapter and accepted it totally? The love of all humanity. I hope a lot, but I don't know. I just will leave it as a question mark. The last part of your question was about history and autobiography and what the historian does within contemporary culture. I don't know exactly how you phrased it. I forgot already. But yeah, I mean, I'm after 77 years, not being an historian, but 77 years of living, and particularly in a world where the humanities seem to be in decline in some respects, not only in the United States but in the world, and where the tradition of great books and history, I worry a lot about how we are losing the message. I always called history, and I'm here quoting a rabbi. I think his name was Adler. He was actually it's kind of weird. He was shot down by one of his congregants. He was a rabbi in Michigan, and just yesterday thank God it wasn't a tragedy in Texas with the rabbi held hostage. But he said a people without history stands naked before the immediate. I always loved that line. I mean, it was a sexy line as well, naked before the immediate. But it seems to me the role of the historian within contemporary culture is, of course, not to become a rabbi or a sermonizer, but nevertheless, to provide some kind of deeper context and appreciation of humanity and the human efforts that precede us, so that we can be nurtured by them and sort of see ourselves within, not simply in the immediate present, but part of a culture, of a civilization that hopefully is constructive, moral, and moving in the right direction. I do believe that the academic has that kind of role as a teacher, to teach humanities in the sense of humanity. So I don't know if I'm crossing boundaries by not being the neutral, objective scholar totally, but I think at my age I can take liberties and argue that indeed that's what an historian should be doing.
You just offered a great example of that. So thank you for crossing those boundaries. Tadeusz, if you want to finish things up, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Ruderman, for a really fascinating talk. We had a lot of good feedback in the chat box. Thank you, Mark, very much for a well-done Q&As, as usual. So thank you very much, and have a good night here in Israel, and have a good afternoon there in the United States. Thank you, guys.